Welcome to DairyLivestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Horde's Dairyman. We are broadcasting from the Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Horde & Sons Company building, commissioned by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Horde. We have three great panelists, and they look forward to answering your questions. You may ask a question by submitting it into the GoToWebinar question panel. I'd also like to remind our audience to ask questions early as you think of them to ensure we have time to ask them during our hour-long webcast here on the topic, Let's Unpack Block and Barrel Cheese Pricing. Why is this topic important to dairy farmers? Why is it important to our industry? It's quite simple. Cheese blocks and barrels, more specifically cheddar blocks and cheddar barrels, play an important role in determining the final pay prices in dairy farm milk checks via provisions in the federal milk marketing order system and how USDA works through all that. If we're truly going to have a national conversation on potential reforms to federal order system and the issues unmasked during this pandemic, we all need to unpack the issues related to block and barrel cheese pricing. That being the case, this dairy live stream will be the first in a 5-part series on topics related to potential federal order reform. So as a prelude to our first guest, let's go to a poll question. What could be taking place in the marketplace? Food service sales has a mozzarella bias. Retail sales have a cheddar bias. All of the above or none of the above. So go ahead and answer that poll question. And we'll wait for a majority of our audience to go ahead and do that. The votes are coming in very strong, and one is a leading answer by a country mile, or a country snowmobile mile, as Kurt would want it. The answer there is indeed all of the above. Food service sales has a mozzarella bias, and retail sales have a cheddar bias. By bias, we're talking that we'll hear more from our cheese experts here, but far more mozzarella gets sold in food service. And on the flip side, cheddar went sky high as more cheddar moved through retail channels as grocers and the federal government's Farmers to Families food box program pushed out cheddar. When it comes to cheese trade, specifically blocks and barrels, the topic of today's dairy live stream, Ted Jacoby has been working with America's top export customers for years. After starting out his career with Bongards Creameries, Ted transitioned to the T. Jacoby Company in 1996. Just 2 years after NAFTA was inked, that's the old U.S., or what used to be the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canadian Agreement, and just 1 year after the U.S. Dairy Export Council was launched, Ted began working out of the company's recently opened Mexico City office. Talk about being on the front lines. These days, Ted's based out of Missouri, and Ted has seen many sides of cheese markets, and I look forward to hearing his insight on U.S. cheese pricing. Ted, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks for that nice introduction. I think if you're going to talk about cheddar block and barrel pricing, the first thing that I think you need to make a distinction about is the difference between the CME spot markets for cheddar barrels and cheddar blocks, and the NDPSR survey, which is the survey of manufacturers that ends up feeding into the Class 3 price that dairy farmers are paid off of. The CME spot markets is a market where, you know, manufacturers and people who have inventories of cheddar block or barrel can sell that physical product on the exchange, and those who are looking to buy it can buy it on the exchange. It's simply a free market or an exchange. Whereas the NDPSR is a survey of what prices the manufacturers have been selling those blocks and barrels for over the course of the previous week. They are related and they are highly correlated almost as a matter of coincidence. Because so many people in the United States price cheese off the CME spot markets. When they survey under the NDPSR, that survey tends to come up with a price very similar to the CME prices. I think what some people may not realize is, for example, blocks the NDPSR survey is often 2 to 3 cents above the CME price. And in barrels, it's often as much as 6 cents above the CME price. And so while they're highly correlated, they're not an exact match. And I would say the relevant question is not necessarily whether the CME spot markets are correct in their pricing. In terms of the way they're designed, they actually function very well. There are times, a 24-hour, 48-hour period where the CME prices often are maybe slightly out of whack. But the reality is there are market forces in play that cause those prices to have a lot of trouble being out of whack, if you will, for a long period of time. For example, if a company can buy cheese out in the countryside at $1.50 and the CME price is $1.60, they're going to be buying that cheese in the countryside and they're going to be selling it on the CME and they're going to make those 10 cents. And so there's an incentive to be a seller when the CME is too high. Likewise, if the market out in the countryside is $1.60 and the CME is trading at $1.50, there's an incentive to be a buyer. And so over a period of time, those markets tend to correct themselves naturally, as markets are supposed to do. To me, the relevant question is the NDPSR survey surveying the right cheese? It surveys 500-pound barrels of cheddar, which is used for processed cheese manufacture, and 40-pound blocks. It is not surveying 640-pound blocks, which is a very large quantity amount of cheddar is made in 640s. And it is not surveying mozzarella, for example, which happens to be the largest amount of cheese manufactured in this country is manufactured as mozzarella, not as cheddar. And so there's an argument that can be made that the NDPSR survey isn't surveying the right cheese, but I think that's a different question than whether the CME markets are functioning in an effective way. So at that point, I can turn it over and we'll go from here.
Thank you very, very much, Ted. Blocks and barrels may be viewed the same as they contain cheese, but just as a Holstein and a Jersey cow have different attributes, so do cheddar blocks and barrels. Let's identify some of those differences in our next poll question. The question is, what makes cheddar barrels different than cheddar blocks? The weight. Yields white whey. Easier to store. All of the above. None of the above. So we'll go ahead and take that poll question. And when we get a good group here that have answered it, we will go ahead and introduce our next guest. And this is an important fundamental here, and we'll put the answer to that poll question. And again, we're trying to establish a conversation here. And so the correct answer is all the above. And Kurt may touch on some of those attributes. And we're very delighted to have Kurt Eperek with us today. Kurt has worked with Great Lakes Cheese for more than 30 years. As Andy Novakovic put it during yesterday's dress rehearsal, Kurt is a member of one of the biggest cheese companies that no one has ever heard of. And that is definitely meant to be a compliment to Kurt and his family. Kurt has held roles in increasing responsibility in sales, production, and procurement at Great Lakes. He's a second-generation owner and currently holds the position of Vice President of Cheese Quality and Dairy Policy. Kurt, I'd say this for sure, you're definitely a cheese guru. Let's further unpack blocks and barrels in their role in the marketplace.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you for having me on. And I guess I'm feeling a little sensitive. Maybe I should say a little bit about Great Lakes Cheese. You know, no one knows us. But we are, as you said, the Eperek family has owned Great Lakes Cheese for over 60 years. The employees are also owners of our company. And we're headquartered in Hiram, Ohio. We have 8 plants that kind of around the country, 2 in New York, 3 in Wisconsin, Ohio, Utah, and Tennessee. Our focus on our business is mainly cheese packaging, specifically a little more heavily geared towards retail packaging than food service, but we do a lot of food service as well. Processed cheese is a segment of our business, and we do have 2 plants that convert milk in the state of New York, one in Adams, New York, that makes cheddar cheese for aging, award-winning cheddar cheese, I should say. And then a plant in Cuba, New York, which makes pasta filata Italian cheese. So, you know, the biggest cheese company, I can say that we're proud to have celebrated in 2020. We've passed 4 billion in sales. So, we're awfully proud of that milestone, and a lot of our 3,500 employees have worked hard to help us attain that goal. I think Andy and Mark were saying you should tell them why you're here. And with Great Lakes Cheese, we're probably one of the largest cheese packagers in the country and purveyors of cheese. So, I guess membership has its privileges, but I thank everybody and all the farmers online here today. So, when I was asked to do this, I wondered why they asked me, and I think the first thing is they asked Ted first, and Ted likes me, so he asked me. Second, like Ted and Jacoby at Great Lakes Cheese, it helps when you're an owner of a proprietary business because you can speak from the heart. You can tell it like it is, and you're not worried about getting fired, or you're not worried about your next job. So I think we're both perfect candidates to talk about this spiny subject. And as we talk about block and barrel, it's always been a little cantankerous, but it's really gotten a little more severe. I think as the export market has grown over the past 5 years, we've seen block, I should say not 5, but 10 years, the block market has become increasingly more popular for export business. And that's created an imbalance. When you look at cheddar cheese, barrels, 680-pound giant blocks and 40-pound blocks, that export customer that comes in and depending on the time of year and the competition can just really clean out a working inventory, and that's created some variations in the block and barrel because of the availability of product. And where a domestic customer is more likely to take a little inventory position, but generally be a customer every week, that export customer has a tendency to buy in big swaths that can go for a specific period of time. I think as we talk about that pricing basis, you have to talk about barrels. And when the rules were set up, barrels and processed cheese were probably a greater percentage of the American style cheese buy. But as time's gone on and as we're into 2020 and beyond, processed cheese is a smaller part. It's great for grilling and hamburgers, but after that, it really has a significantly smaller role in the American shopper's basket. So that said, I think we're in for a robust conversation, and I'm ready to answer questions. Just don't get me in trouble, Corey or Mark.
We'll do our best. Kurt, I would, before we move to Mark here, I'd like you to touch a little bit about the discussion about blocks versus barrels in the color of that cheddar, and then
Sure.
the end product, another end product of whey. So talk a little bit about that right now.
Yes. So unfortunately, in the United States, the cheddar demand is for colored cheddar. There are a handful of places in the Northeast specifically that white cheddar is the norm, but the majority of the country and the majority of the pounds in both food service and retail are about colored cheddar. So that 40-pound block or 640 being colored creates a byproduct that it makes colored whey, because the annatto that is used to color the cheese travels in the whey, and it has to be bleached out. Now, plenty of countries have written in their spec for their tenders that they cannot have bleached whey, and most of the whey that comes from a cheddar plant is probably bleached whey. So it limits the market. It devalues it compared to a white whey. So white whey, if you're making cheddar, comes generally once in a while from a Northeast plant that makes white aged cheddar, or in a large form, but those plants are generally smaller, and you have a hard time creating a huge value-added whey stream off of a smaller whey flow, where the big mozzarella plants are clearly at an advantage making white whey, or a large barrel plant making white whey, and that usually goes into the infant formula market and is far more greatly exported. So, and I think the other thing you have to talk about barrel and block, there is the cheddar 40-pound block is a ready-to-eat product that has to have a certain flavor and melting characteristic and body characteristic to be put in a shred, in a slice, or in a bar, where a barrel is going to be further processed and used as a base for processed cheese, where by nature it's being made into a melting cheese, and you can do a lot of variations in your formulations to create that. So formula, the amount of fortification in milk and the make procedures, it's far more forgiving to make a barrel cheese than a block cheese. And as a result, I think you can say that barrel, if you don't have a customer, the easiest cheese to make is a barrel, because if you have the capacity, because you know that there's value in the white whey, you can store it and it can be used at a later date and not degrade like a 40-pound block would. And generally it's in a universal shape that every processor can use. So it just makes it an easier bet. And usually I would say around the country that barrel plants have a little more flex. Most 40-pound block cheddar plants run about at capacity, and the only time they don't is when something's wrong or there's a planned down day for maintenance, where barrel plants have a tendency to flex a little more, so they end up taking more of the spot milk that is out there.
Kurt, I really appreciate that explanation and bringing our viewers along here. And even on our dress rehearsal, I learned some things I didn't know, and I really appreciate that. We're going to go to one more question here, a poll question. What group played a key role in cheese price discovery? The Wisconsin Cheese Exchange from 1918 to 1958, which would have been in Plymouth. The National Cheese Exchange, 1958 to 1997, which would have been in Green Bay. Or the CME, which once was called the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Now it's just a three-letter acronym, from 1997 to the present. Or all of the above. So we'll wait a little bit for that answer here. And I think, again, this is important. When you hear Ted and Kurt talk, they really understand cheese markets. And these exchanges were brought together to get like-minded individuals to help establish a market price. And we'll talk a little bit about that and the growing complexities here. And 82% of you were right on that. All three of them were. When it comes, and indeed, again, as I was talking about, cheesemakers started these exchanges both in New York and in Wisconsin because they wanted to determine some value for the product they were making. And you do that by coming together in a marketplace. That value, in turn, would help make buying and selling decisions. The Wisconsin Cheese Exchange specifically kept that name in 1958 after moving from Plymouth, Wisconsin to Green Bay. But as the markets changed in 1978, the Wisconsin Cheese Exchange was rebranded the National Cheese Exchange. And in 1997, the National Cheese Exchange ceased, and its activity largely moved to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And again, now that's known as simply the CME. Mark, that's quite a journey, and cheese pricing and cheese markets continue to evolve. That's why we developed this program today on DairyLivestream. You've studied the topic for the entirety of your professional career, Mark. Please paint us a picture of today and what the future might hold.
Okay, so I guess you basically said I'm the old man of the group. Not sure I appreciate that, Corey, but there you go. I'll carry it.
Great amount of wisdom. Great amount of wisdom.
Yeah, actually I have done a lot of reading, of both the history of the dairy industry as well as studying it for several decades now and working in it. But, in going back to that reading, particularly when you look back at the Plymouth Cheese Exchange, when that was created, it was partially done because there was a new technology that really enabled things to happen, and that was the telephone. So back in the early 1900s, Plymouth became this center because of the telephone industry available up here. And, more than just price discovery per se, we think about these things a lot as price discovery, but at that point in time, it was actually a sales mechanism. It provided a way when it was hard to physically get together to travel even 20 miles, that we could pick up the phone and we could link buyers and sellers together, and we had an opportunity to sell some product. I think when we look at something like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange today, we probably think about this a bit more as being a price discovery mechanism than we do a real sales product. I don't think that Kurt's Kurt's idea of selling cheese is just to take everything to the CME and see what we can get a price for it. However, a few years ago when I was pretty interested in CME and its activities, I did talk to one of the leading cheese manufacturers in the country and was asking them questions about, do we need the CME? Is this something that's really actively necessary today? And his question or answer to that was an unequivocal yes. If we didn't have it, we would have to recreate something like that. And he said, in no small part, there are actually times when we need to get rid of a load of cheese. We've got a line that goes down. We've got cheese that's coming in. We won't be able to catch up and process this stuff. So we actually have to take a couple loads to the exchange to find a buyer and get rid of it, or vice versa. We need an extra load and we may buy it. So there is actually that sales component there, but it does provide the benchmark of a price, as Ted pointed out earlier too, that if you think that price isn't right, either too high or too low, you can challenge it. If you think it's too high, let's bring some cheese to the marketplace and try to sell it. If you think it's too low, let's try to buy some cheese and move the price around. And that provides a method for everybody to use that price as a major benchmark. In my opinion, the single most important benchmark to our dairy industry with regard to what's going on are in fact the prices at the CME for, in particular, cheese. If you had to pick a single one, you'd probably say blocks, but barrels are critically important as well. And you might say, well, why do we focus so specifically on that cheddar market? It's not a matter of whether we are representing all the cheese that's necessary down there, but I think it's more like, does it give us a good indication of the tightness of the dairy markets or how badly we want or need cheese product? So the CME is really providing an incredibly important function that would have to be duplicated if we didn't have it. 50 years ago or more, when we were first beginning to put together federal milk marketing orders, this country was largely about fluid milk. There were manufacturing products. Butter was a primary product that was manufactured at that time. Cheese was kind of along for the ride. And if you look at the federal order pools back in the 1950s, it was about 2/3 being fluid milk and the other third being manufacturing. So we had a system that was built around serving fluid milk needs. And at that point in time, it made sense to construct federal orders the way they were constructed, and we've been evolving them ever since. But today our dairy industry utilizes almost 60% of the milk to make cheese, and fluid milk is about 1/3 of the volume of the milk going into cheese products. So it's a very different market today. We have basically a fluid regulation, in federal milk marketing orders in a manufacturing world. And, we're seeing some of the stresses and strains. One of those was played out in full view this last year with the pandemic. When we had cheese prices that crashed on, what was it, April 14 or 15, I don't remember which date, to $1 a pound. We hadn't seen that kind of low price for more than 15 years. And 2 months later, we were at $3 a pound, a high price that we had never seen before. This is extreme volatility. And when you've got that much of a benchmark moving milk prices around, it's certainly going to cause some problems and differences on farms. The other thing is discussion, I guess, has talked a little bit about blocks and barrels. Historically, when we had the federal order reform back in the late 1990s, passed in 2000, the block barrel spread had historically been about 3.5 cents a pound. And we built that into that NDRS, our NDPSR report that we compensate for barrel prices by adding 3 cents to it, three and a half. I don't remember. I should. But at any rate, the spread over the last 5 years or so has been more like 12 cents or a little bit more than that. So adding 3 cents is not capturing really quite the right value for the barrels that are in there, if in fact you want to make a block equivalent price. So, that can be a bit of an issue too. And in fact, the spread between blocks and barrels over just these last several years has been as much as $1 a pound. That was really unusual. And we've had an inversion, where we had barrels higher than blocks of about 37 cents, I think, something like that. So we've had prices moving in pretty unusual ways, and it is causing some problems with federal order regulation of prices. So with that, I think I would just say, let's have some discussion.
Well, thank you, Mark. Let's start with a big picture question. Are block and barrel prices actually related to one another anymore? Has the different attributes changed that much that maybe the relationship has changed? Mark, you want to start with that one?
Well, those are both products that are made through a cheddaring process. But Kurt, certainly identified some major differences. One product is a white cheese, uncolored. The other is usually colored. So different product. Moistures are different. There's less uniformity in a barrel of cheese from the center of the barrel to the outside than you have with a block. You can't really do all of the same things with one that you do with the other. And I don't know of very many plants that would say, these are substitutable. I can take a barrel and, make the kind of shreds or slices or something that I'm going to sell to retail as I do with a block. But I'm not the person doing that. Maybe Kurt or Ted should respond.
I think you hit it. I think you hit it on the head, Mark. They're very limited outlets other than processed cheese for a barrel make, and part of it is the way it's made and the body characteristics and also the color. So,
and I put it this way: one of the things that I think has changed a lot over the last 40 years in the cheese industry is the cheese industry has continued to grow faster than just about every other segment of the dairy industry. You've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, more streamlined cheese plants who have, in the process, taken away their flexibility. 20 years ago, there were probably 15 plants that could produce both blocks and barrels. Today, I think there's 3. And there's also 2 plants that can make barrels and mozzarella cheese. So it's, the difference between a block and a barrel cheddar is about almost the same from a production standpoint as the difference between mozzarella and cheddar. It's that different. And so they're basically different markets.
We're going to go straight to a reader or a viewer question here. And I always try to share the acronyms here. And I know the panel here knows that NDPSR is an acronym they use each and every day, but that stands for National Dairy Product Sales Report. So the question is, the National Dairy Product Sales Report, according to this viewer, volumes have outpaced blocks so far in 2021, flipping the historical relationship from 53-47 blocks to 53/47 barrels. Given that government purchases have slowed down, do you expect block volumes to overtake barrel volumes moving forward? Pretty deep question. Anyone want to tackle that one?
I can tackle it. The short answer is yes, I do. But I would also say that the volume on the NDPSR can really be a subject of some debate. And I tend to look at, when I think about cheese pricing and block and barrel pricing, I really think about it in terms of overall capacity, plant capacity. For example, you take a cheddar plant that can produce 40-pound blocks. Most of those plants can produce colored cheddar in 40-pound blocks, white cheddar in 40-pound blocks, pepper jack, Colby, and even Parmesan, industrial Parmesan for grading. And so what will happen as you're going along seasonally in the year is that capacity gets switched around into these different cheeses, and that can affect the volume reported on the NDPSR. And the volume, and the same thing can happen on the barrel side, as a couple of those plants will switch from making maybe mozzarella versus making barrels. The capacity, the available capacity never changes. What changes, though, may be how much cheddar block or how much cheddar barrel that is reportable to the NDPSR that's what changes, that volume. That doesn't always correlate directly with price, because there's a capacity demand relationship that probably has the bigger effect. So I actually don't pay a huge amount of attention to the volumes, but I would say overall, my expectation of the ratio of barrel to block volume on the NDPSR is usually skewed towards, in the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, blocks have started to outpace barrels relatively significantly. And over the course of the year, somewhere between 55 and 60% blocks versus 40 to 45% barrels is about what I expect those averages to be. They may vary week to week or even month to month, but over the course of the year, that's where they tend to end up.
And, periodically, Corey, when we had cheese that hit $1 a pound, there was a little flurry of activity for export sales. And, this is product where we're going to have a contract that will be written between buyer and seller. We determined the price and delivery terms, but this is a product that is unlikely to be counted in the National Dairy Sales Report because it can't be delivered in that 30-day time period. And that automatically says, well, that product should not be reported. So, the time lags can be a bit of an issue too as to what gets reported and what doesn't.
And I'll just to add to that, Mark, when you're exporting 40-pound blocks, the rest of the world wants white cheddar. The NDPSR is colored cheddar. And so if you're exporting a block, you're probably not reporting any of it to the NDPSR.
So this next question is a little bit more of a clarification. Ted almost answered it, but I want to bring this viewer and the others right up to speed here. So you're saying most converting plants cannot switch between 40-pound blocks and 6 40-pound barrels, shredder barrels for shredded product?
You go ahead, Kurt.
Yes, it does require, barrels are rather dangerous to handle without the proper equipment. So without a doubt, it does not switch. You don't switch between barrels and 40-pound blocks. There are some, the other entity we don't talk about much that is also a huge product in a conversion plan is a 640-pound giant block. And those can be substituted on a limited basis. They tend to create less trim, but you need specialized equipment to handle it. But, along with the specification differences on color and body, clearly it requires special equipment. So you're generally, and let's face it, most of the cheese that's purchased by conversion plants is on contract using the CME weekly and monthly averages to create a price, and the business is just a transaction weekly that takes place. There's a PO created a couple weeks in advance. It gets filled based on the price that is for that week, and it gets brought in and stored and ultimately used sometime in the next month or so. So that's the way the majority of cheese is being sold. When we talk about the CME's market, that is generally as Mark said, a bit of an oops. Either you have too much and you want to sell it and no one wanted to buy it, so it's the market of last resort. Or if you need it, you've called around, you've asked for cheese and there isn't any readily available, and you put in the buy order. So let's not kid ourselves. And also with the NDPSR, a lot of the cheeses that get purchased have a certain overage that you're paying for certain characteristics, or on barrel you're paying for moisture. So those numbers are elevated for those reasons as well. So, but that's probably one of the issues that I have a big problem with at the CME is specifications, because for the most part, the specifications haven't changed a whole lot on cheese over the past 20 years, but the specifications around quality and documentation and testing have changed immensely in 20 years as the quality expectations of the customers have increased. So that's where, that's also helps make the CME a little more of a market of last resort versus the first place you want to buy cheese.
Well,
Kurt, and maybe Ted, I was also curious, if we're using the CME as a primary benchmark, about all this cheese product that is manufactured but is not cheddar cheese, is not the specs, that we would have to sell or to buy on the CME, still an awful lot of the contracts are going to be negotiated as CME plus or CME minus or something. How much of the total cheese in this country is actually priced off of the exchange? Would you guess? I mean, we don't know the exact number, but is it like 80%?
Kurt, you want me to handle that?
Sure.
So I would say it's probably well over 50%, probably approaching 70 to 80%. I would say anything that's coming out of a cheddar plant, let's say a cheddar block plant, is probably being priced off the cheddar block market. If it's coming out of a 640, a giant block cheddar plant, it's probably being priced off the 40-pound block market. If it's coming out of a barrel plant, it's probably being priced off the barrel market. If it's coming out of a mozzarella plant, most of it's probably being priced off the block market. And so, that's 70, I'd say that's close to 75% of all cheese produced in the United States is probably in one form or another priced off one of those CME markets.
I think when you look at, there are certain cheeses that have a composition, you're skimming a lot of fat or doing other things. One of those is Swiss. Those have a tendency to be more milk, class 3 milk based. But I think literally everything else is block, and it's the circle. Our customers want to have a definable market to which they can compare pricing to, and that's the CME. So even if it isn't the best correlation, on a make component basis, it is the most identifiable market for less experienced cheese buyers. They can always look at what that stamp of price was, and that's their comfort level, and everybody is equalized to that. When you compare your pricing and what you're getting from the multiple entities, that is the basis for which all pricing is built. So, and if you throw a different type of pricing formula at them with milk, generally you're considered a sneaky thief, and we don't want to talk with you because we've tried it, and we're not sneaky thieves, but we just want to give the most accurate value for milk to the manufacturer. But quite honestly, that basis risk is there because the ultimate customer, that's the way they want to buy the cheese. And I think it's a little different for you at times, Ted. You can talk about the component value on an export deal, and it's a little easier. You're talking about a price of something with a component value, but when you buy things, when customers want to buy in the United States, it is totally always a reference back to the CME.
I agree.
So, I'm gonna jump in here because we have well over a dozen questions that are backlogged here. So I'm gonna come up with a clarification, and I'm gonna get back to that one. And Kurt's last comment: does this tightly structured relationship between cheddar cheese production and purchase orders explain why we saw huge changes in the CME block price? Was this a result of sporadic and somewhat unpredictable purchases under the food box program? So go ahead and grab that one. Then we're going to do one big picture question, and then we're going to go to rapid response, where I'm just going to call on one of you, and we'll try to get these answered. Because I'll tell you what, the audience, Mark, looks like about half of our great dairy economist forums and meetings that typically happen in May of the year, and then the other half is a lot of dairy farmers that want to learn more. So, Kurt, go ahead and grab that question.
Clearly, we saw it shortly after the market fell. There were some exports deals written, and then the POs came in from a retail. Food service was pretty slow. Then the food box program got announced, and quite honestly, there wasn't enough cheese to go around for all the demand that people had, and the end result was that last load of cheese that someone wanted just pushed the market way beyond what was believed to be possible, and it was, synthetic demand for the government, from the government, although it beneficial, and it was there to help the farms, and it was there to help the farmers, and it was there to help the people in need, and it did both. And it just did it affected the market way more severely. And I can speak for Great Lakes Cheese. The challenge was the supply chain. The time that you were awarded the business and the POs started to deliver was so short. You didn't have the cheese when you put the bid in, and you still didn't have the cheese when you when you got the orders in, and you hope to have the cheese when the orders needed to be made. So that was the unusual demand. Normally our businesses have far more planned supply chains, but that Food to Families or Farmer to Families box program clearly blew that supply chain out of the water.
So we're going to wrap 3 questions into one. This will be the final question for now that we throw to the whole panel. But the first question, and I think we can bundle them pretty nice, is the Class 3 formula still an accurate way to predict the value of milk? And then kind of a fun one here is cheddar, cheddar, cheddar. Shouldn't we talk about cheddar and mozzarella on equal footing when we're establishing Class 3 prices after all those 2 cheeses are near equals in the marketplace? And then another reader question is, we produce more mozzarella in the U.S. today than when the federal order reform occurred. Should we be considering including mozzarella in the price discovery for dairy? So let's bundle those all together. And I'm going to maybe say we start with Mark and then have Ted and Kurt follow up on that one.
Well, I guess that, we heard already a couple of opinions that the vast majority of cheese, both mozz and, cheddar type products, are being priced off the CME already. So if we've got a good barometer that's moving prices up or down, it may be good enough. We probably don't have to have everything included in a survey in order to move that marketplace. Are the formulas right? Do they need adjustment? I think they do. A good example might be the spread that we have between the barrels and the blocks right now is one of the issues. Make allowances haven't been touched in a decade. You can't tell me that costs have not moved at all. So, I think there are a number of things. And finally, our product price formula is the best way that we can discover milk prices.
Ted and Kurt, anything to add in that realm?
So the one thing I would say when you're talking about cheddar versus mozzarella is, it's one thing to say, yes, I would love to see mozzarella included in the survey and be a part of milk pricing formulas. It's another thing entirely to say, there's a way that we can establish what the going price is for mozzarella independently of cheddar. Because in the mozzarella industry, I would say every single plant that produces mozzarella, those plants are each known by the differences in the quality of their mozzarella in one way or another. And so an even exchange for mozzarella, I think, is a really difficult thing to establish. And I'll let Kurt talk a little bit more about that. On the whole, is Class 3 milk and the way we're doing it, the way they price it, I agree with Mark. It needs to be tweaked. I think there's issues about how the surveys are done. There's issues about what cheeses are included in the surveys. I think there's obviously the make allowance is an issue. There are also issues in my eyes about how the federal order system and pricing affects our ability to export that really should be explored. I don't have answers, and I don't think this is the forum to talk about that, but there's issues there as well. So there's a lot of reasons why getting into federal order reform and really exploring different options to improve the milk price for the dairy farmer makes sense.
Kurt, are you good there? Anything to add?
I just think that the mozzarella argument, let's remember that most of the mozzarella is a part skim product, so you're automatically skimming fat. The components are different than a whole milk cheese, so that throws off that correlation between cheddar and mozz. And then, it is a more storable cheese. There's a lot of frozen mozzarella sold in this country, and not a lot of frozen cheddar. So I mean, it then distorts the market because of inventory holds. It can come back on the market. Gee, didn't we just recently declare a new crop butter, and what was the dynamics on the market before and after? So you could deal with that type of distortion that could occur. So I'm as much as it makes sense to add mozzarella on there, I think there's the devil's in the details on that.
So we're gonna, since Kurt's a first-time guest here, we're gonna ask 2 questions. Kurt gets his pick, and Ted gets the other one, and we'll maybe do that again here. So, but they're related. Question number 1: are you finding enough liquidity in the CME futures market to cover your cheese price risk? Question number 2: are there changes at the CME for cash trading to narrow the spread between block and barrel prices? So you pick which one you want, and I'll repeat the other one for Ted.
This one's easy because Ted's more of a futures guy than I am, and I've been talking about changes at the CME for a while. So as I spoke earlier in a conversation, for block and barrel, we need to modify the rules to build more quality parameters around every load of cheese that's sold. It's anonymous, and you don't know where the cheese is coming from. Every one of the major cheese converters in this country follows an SQF program that requires a known identity and process diagram and customer, vendor details. And we're making an anonymous purchase. And sometimes we buy from the CME and most of the time it is with a certified vendor that we have. But if it's not, there automatically starts to be a list of things you have to do to bring this cheese into your plant and be used. And the bottom line is we have issues with ingredients used for coloring. We have issues with no micro testing being done. I should say micro test or pathogen testing being done. And then the certifications from certifying programs like the SQF. In order to be an SQF plant, you have to either vet a huge amount of testing on the product to ensure it's right, or you need to buy from an SQF vendor. And at this point, it's not the CME's fault, it's the industry's fault for not demanding it. But we don't have any of those certifications. And then if you get in a situation, you're actually testing for pathogens, and that's the worst place to test for pathogens is when a product has been out of the hold segment and you have it spread all over the country. So I'm a firm believer in that. And what does that give you? Some people say it's going to limit transactions on the exchange. I say it makes it easier to buy and easier to sell if we all know the quality the quality and documentation is going to be with the cheese, and it should add volume to the exchange, which is in everybody's favor because you'll get a more accurate depiction of the current market conditions.
So Ted, thank you, Kurt. I'll repeat the question for you then. Are you finding enough liquidity in the CME futures market to cover your cheese price risk?
So I'll start by saying this. Liquidity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more liquidity in the market, the more I'd use the market. The more I'd use the market, the more liquidity in the market. So I will always ask for more liquidity because it improves the market, it improves the price discovery mechanism, and it makes it much easier for us to hedge risk the more liquid those markets are. Having said that, are the markets liquid enough? The answer is usually yes. They definitely have room for improvement, but they are liquid enough. And I guess that's the way I describe it is, please let me have more liquidity. I'd love more liquidity, but they are liquid enough to take care of most of what we need done.
But Ted, wouldn't you say we've seen in the last 4 years, we've seen the OTC markets just boom. So yes, there could be a lot more liquidity on the CME if there were more people on the CME, because obviously there's a lot of OTCs that are taking place that you have to believe they like that avenue better than the CME's rules and options there.
Well, absolutely. And in my personal opinion, whether you're hedging on the CME or through the OTC market, which would be off the CME, that liquidity is interrelated enough that it's one or the other. I mean, when we're looking to hedge something, we're looking at both markets, and we're going to choose the one that gives us the best value, whether we're trying to hedge to the long side or to the short side. And I think there's a lot of people who do that. So
true.
Mark, next question's yours, and I asked this viewer for clarification. So the first part is, can dairy go to a two-tier price system? After the viewer clarified it, he said two-tier would be a manufacturing price and a fluid price. What are your thoughts there?
Sure. I mean, at one point in time, in some of our federal orders, we had as many as 8 classes of milk. So, and for a long period of time, we in most orders only had 3 classes of milk, and then we split it. Now we've got 4. So there's nothing that says that Moses had 4 classes on the tablets, and that's the only thing we can have. We can have 2 classes, and it perhaps makes some sense. However, I will say that we have to be careful with this, because when we're pricing this milk, it's not the price for milk, that comes down from the federal orders. It's the minimum price for milk. And you can't have a minimum price that's higher than a market clearing level. If you do that, you've got all kinds of problems. If it's a little bit below that, premiums can step in to fill in the gap. But you got to give the markets a little bit of room to maneuver, because nobody is smart enough to price the price for milk.
That'd be great if it was true, but it's not. This is a quick and a short follow-up question. So Kurt alluded to that the buyers and sellers are really anonymous on the CME. To do a transaction there, do you at least have to have credentials, or how does that work, real briefly? Or maybe Mark wants to grab that one.
Ted's done more transactions than I have, so I'm going to let Ted talk.
I'll answer that. You need to have an account with the CME in order to do it, and there are some credentials. They're not particularly tough, but there are some credentials that you need to provide in order to be registered, in order to participate. But just about anybody can do it. The one thing I would add is this is always an interesting debate between Kurt and I. Is it easier to be a buyer or a seller on the CME? I've always thought it's easier to be a buyer, because all you need is money to be a buyer on the CME. You actually need cheese to be a seller. But Kurt owns a cheese plant, so it's a lot easier for him to be a seller.
And our quality department has all these expectations. So you really stick out like a sore thumb if you buy cheese that can't be used in your cheese plant, which a lot of what transacts on the CME is. So in there lies the challenge. Would you rather be able to sell something and not have to worry about it, or you get something in a truckload quantity and then you have to figure out what you're going to do with it? Yep. In there lies the argument, right, Ted?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that when you were trying to throw that question to me, Corey, I was just sitting here thinking, what am I going to do with 40,000 pounds of cheese?
Have one heck of a party.
So
have a tailgate outside Camp Randall this fall. How about that? Well, here's a good question coming from a prominent dairy leader. CME is only concerned with people that use it. CME operates outside of federal orders. How do you change specifications or other issues? We've answered some of that already, but is there anything we should add in that area there as a response?
Corey, let me just throw out one thing. It's not the whole answer to this question, but the reason that we have tight specifications on a product like cheddar cheese, it's got to be within a certain amount of moisture and so much salt and, color and all the rest of it, is because we want the only thing that can be negotiated is price. Okay. And I think that Kurt was just telling us that, there are some extra characteristics we need to try to capture in this specification for cheese that would make it easier, because it's not just price now. We need to know some other things about it. So with that, I would just say, tell us what they should be.
Let's leave that one there. Kind of a fun question here, and you know what? I want viewers to know this. Is cheese really placed in the barrel, or what does that container look like? Kurt, you want to grab that one real quick?
Oh, well, it used to kind of resemble a chemical or fluid barrel, and it was metal. But since then, it has gone to a plastic bag and a corrugated box with multiple dimensions. It's still cylindrical, but more octagonal, I guess, or close to it. So a barrel used to be in, and it used to have the little nuts, and you put the top on and sealed it. So it was very much a barrel at one point, but now it is a cylindrical 500-pound block of cheese that is usually vacuum packed. So,
real quick additional follow-up for you, Kurt. Way back when we started the program, you were talking about cheese colorings. Do you have a brief opinion on beta carotene versus annatto for colored?
yes,
coloring?
as the strict guidelines for food safety and SQF, all of the labeling generally says annatto, and annatto is what most of the cheese sold in the United States has. There's clearly a desire by some manufacturers to preserve white whey, and if you add beta carotene, the beta carotene gets absorbed in the fat and does not go with the protein stream. So as a result, you'll make white whey that's not bleached if you use beta carotene. So there's been a desire by some to do that, but the problem is all the packaging for food service and retail, huge amounts of it say annatto, and thus disqualify that for use in the marketplace. So what I make the comment, and it frustrates people, if you're selling beta carotene cheese on the exchange, you're selling a devalued product, and that's creating the price basis for all the other cheeses sold in the United States. So people don't like that answer, but I believe it to be true, because if someone said, I have a bunch of beta carotene cheese, what would you give me? It would be a discount off of the going rate of cheddar cheese.
We got about 4 minutes left here. We're going to go to a question we talked about yesterday. Curds and whey, at one time, all whey products were unique. However, I know some of you would contend, some of you on the program, that whey permeate has become a commodity. Should whey permeate be added to surveys to establish the price of milk at farm gate? If it indeed has become a commodity, are there other products that should at least be put on the discussion plate? Quickly, round robin, Ted.
Yes, I actually think that, so the fine line is you don't want to put value added, we're talking minimum price, so you don't want to put a value added product into the survey and into the pricing mechanism. But what happens over time is products that 40 years ago were value added today are a commodity. And once they've commoditized, I think they should. And today there's more whey permeate that is sold than there is sweet whey powder. And so having whey permeate as a part of the survey, and maybe some of the lower level whey protein concentrates, to me would make a lot of sense.
Any others on the list, Kurt or Mark?
Well, I would say that that makes some sense, Ted. I accept that argument. But, conceptually, if you're trying to say, what's the value of milk? And I'm going to look at the product stream that's made from that milk. Cheese is one of them. Then you got the whey stream. Dry sweet whey is an easy endpoint, and you've got butter from the whey cream out there. If you're going to say permeate should be in there, I'm also going to say, well, then you better have something like WPC 34 or something, or not.
Right. Yep, absolutely.
In our final quick question, big picture here in 15 seconds or less for each of you, is dairy product demand or dairy product supply changing faster in today's marketplace? Mark, we'll start with you.
Oh gosh, I would say it's demand. I mean, in our current marketplace, I don't know, Kurt and Ted, what you guys would have thought of as being your long-term demand forecast. I'm sure you all have models for that, but I bet they aren't a year out now at this point in time. You're looking at weeks out. We aren't sure about restaurants being opened or closed, or schools serving lunches in cafeterias. We aren't sure about some of the export products. So, boy, demand can swing really quickly, much more so than milk production does.
Kurt?
Yeah, I would agree with Mark. It's a demand question, but I do think we have in 2021 some huge supply changes that people have to be aware of, and it is the Michigan plant making 40-pound blocks and 640s. It is barrel plants that are adding capability to make 40-pound blocks. So everybody who said the last 5 years is the model and it's all about export and retail is going to grow X, I would argue we have more of a supply question than we've had in a long time. So hold on to your pant loops, because it's going to get interesting.
Final word is yours, Ted.
Well, I agree with both Mark and Kurt. I'd only add that The supply of milk out there is increasing too, somewhere between 2 and 3%, based on whether or not you believe what the USDA is saying about California milk production right now.
Ding, ding.
So,
Well-
but I'll just say this: it's always demand. Demand always leads supply, because as demand changes, it forces supply to change, and so demand will always be the leader. It will always change faster.
Thank you very much. Our next dairy live stream will focus on what's the balance between retail and farm gate prices. This show will air Wednesday, March 24th, 2021 at 11 o'clock Central Daylight Time. I got to change from standard here. We're going to have daylight savings time here real soon. And it will be archived on the Hordes Dairyman YouTube channel the very next day, and also our website. So if you watch this program today here and want to share it, tell your coworkers or another dairy farmer that you need to watch it. We'll have it up tomorrow, and we have all of our past programs here. And I look forward to seeing you on March 24th. On behalf of Kurt, Ted, and Mark, I'm Corey Geiger, your host for today. We thank you for joining us, and we wish you all a good day. Thank you for the great insight from our panel. We appreciate it. Bye-bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you, Corey. Thanks, everyone.